Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here today with you all. I hope you enjoy this conference. And first and foremost, so I hope everyone is well and keeping safe. Thank you, Bob, for this invitation to speak with you today. And I hope you enjoy the next half hour or so talking about Yucatecan literature. And I hope this encourages some of you to read some more. Most of these works I will be talking about today are in Spanish, although there are some translations available. So the talk I will bring to you today is called Ermilo Abreu Gómez and the story of Jacinto Canek, crossovers between history and literature in Yucatan. Ermilo Abreu Gómez is one of Yucatan's foremost writers from around the middle of the 20th century. And Canek is one of his most well-known works, although increasingly less read as time goes by. I discover that my students are reading less and less of his work, and I hope that this encourages many more people to have another look at what he's talking about. The work I'm mostly going to be talking about today is the story of Canek, which was written in 1940, and we were going to do this conference in 2020 when it was the 80th anniversary of the publication of the book. So let's see what comes out just now. Okay, so Emilio Abreu Gómez was born in Merida in 1894, and he died in 1971. He's, as I said, a very important author, researcher, intellectual in the Yucatan, and he has had different classifications within literature, but I tend to think that most of our writers defy the boxes we try to put them in. So we'll just try and take a look at his varied work, and then I will concentrate on Canek. So he began really as a writer for theatre and wrote one of his most famous works in 1919 called Bai, which is the story of our famous seductress who seduces wayward men in the early hours of the night and gives them their punishment. He then he has several other works, but I would also like to highlight his work on Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Abreu Gómez was one of the foremost researchers from about the 1930s, looking at rediscovering really Sor Juana, whose work had been little studied in the 19th century. And he really brought her back to the fore with his work from the 1930s onwards. He wrote at least three works, and this is one of the most well-known, La Ruta de Sor Juana, Sor Juana's routes, I think perhaps you say in the US. So that's also a very interesting work, and it connected him internationally to other researchers. There's some very interesting letters between Emilio Abreu Gómez and researchers in the US who were also looking into Sor Juana at that time. Very, very important line of his work. We then get to his works on Maya figures, Maya heroes, he calls them, written from the 1940s onwards. There's a line that goes through several of these works, which is about Maya rebellions, all have Maya protagonists, and it gives a new place in Yucatecan literature to Maya people. Clearly, he's still a non-Maya person speaking for the Maya people. Let's not have any confusion there. He is empathetic to the First Peoples, to the Maya community, and he's trying to rewrite these stories and put them in the forefront of discussion within the literary community. There's some very interesting comments made about these works during the 40s and 50s. Some of which I'll try and look into, and really many people therefore classify him as an indigenous writer in the stage of literary writings when white writers wrote for the First Peoples, for the Maya peoples. This is many decades before what we now call the Maya Renaissance and literary writings in Maya language directly. However, Abreu Gómez grew up in close contact with Maya-speaking communities. His father took him traveling around around the peninsula and stayed in villages, and he was often left in the kitchen. As he tells his stories, he was often left in the kitchen and of houses they visited, and so he would listen to all the stories that were being told. And he recalls that one of the ones that most impressed him was the story of Canek, and so he gives quite a different version here of the versions of the stories that were being told about Canek commonly at the time. So it becomes very interesting. One of the most significant rewritings he makes, in fact, is to present Canek as a hero and as a Maya hero. So this catapults one of the first indigenous protagonists into Mexican literature, Canek, and so it gives it a prominent place in literature studies. And this is a very strong reversal of the exclusions that Maya characters were suffering at this time. So in his second work, Maya Heroes, Samna Nachikokom and Canek in 1942, he gives another writing, another version of the Canek story from 1940, and places it in a series with three very prominent Maya rebels, previous rebels and leaders, community leaders, Samna and Nachikokom. I will explain a little bit more about that shortly. Indian Shipwreck is also a very, very interesting novel. His first major novel, really, a full-length novel, written in 1951. A very, very interesting story set within the context of the visit of the Empress Charlotte, Maximilian's wife, to Merida in 1865. This is set during the Caste War and is a supposedly fictional account, but some historians consider that it was quite possible that this event actually did happen, although there is no documentation. It's quite possible that it could have happened, as during that time, many Maya rebels were loaded onto boats and sent to Cuba as to be exiled. It's quite plausible to imagine that one of them shipwrecked, and that's the story that is told here. So it's very interesting that Abreu Gómez puts that take or that version, that twist to the story. Again, once again, the Maya characters in the novel are the protagonists, and they are the ones who are telling the story, as with Canek and with Maya heroes. The story La del Alba Siria, at Daybreak, is a very interesting autobiography written in 1954 of Abreu Gómez, and it's a very, very interesting, very valuable information about what Yucatan was like at that time. He clearly describes the isolation of Yucatan as well, how difficult it was to move to Mexico City, for example. He describes the first time that he went to Mexico City and describing getting on the boat from Progreso, going to Veracruz, then getting on a train, and then finally arriving in Mexico City. It was quite a long trip before the 50s. In the 1950s, there was a railway built from Merida to Mexico City, and it's not until the 70s that there's actually a main road built to Mexico City. The second, it's not really part of the autobiography, but the second book that he writes about his life in Yucatan is called Stories of My People. That's in 1957, which are really custom-based tales about Yucatan. We then come to a third very interesting fictional work called La Conjura de Chinom, which is directly about the Caste War in Yucatan. So continues on really from Indian shipwrecks. And then one of the final pieces is called Tales and Legends of Ancient Yucatan, which was published in 1961. And this reprints Maya heroes and also includes several other tales and legends from Yucatan. And it's again, a very interesting piece of work. So that's mainly what some of his major work. He also has many works on linguistics, on grammar, and Merida is a very, very prolific writer. But today we're going to center on the two principal versions of Canek. And I also mentioned a little bit about the Shipwreck of Indians and Conjura de Chinum because they tie into the way the thought process behind his rewriting of these Maya leaders, Maya rebels, who are so important in the context of giving Yucatan and giving the Maya people a voice. So let's have a look at this Abreu Gómez's fiction and his alternative stories of rebellions in a little more detail. These are some of the early book covers of these texts, as used to be the case in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. Very simple book covers. These are some of the first editions. So Abreu Gómez states that a novel should always possess a latent enigma, and I think that's part of the enticement that we find behind these alternative stories that he's telling of the rebellions. So if we look a little bit about the history behind these, each of these stories is based on a factual historical event. Abreu Gómez fictionalizes them. It's true; he's not writing history. He's writing fiction, but he bases his stories on fictional events and on historical events. I'm sorry, and within those historical events, he focuses on specific conflicts. So in Maya Heroes, he writes 3 stories about the three Maya heroes that he outlines: Zamna, Kokom, and Canek. Now, Zamna is set in pre-Hispanic Spain, pre-Hispanic Yucatan, in the time before the Mayas are, according to different versions, reinvaded by the Toltecs. So Zamna is the great Maya is the great Maya leader who becomes then deified as Itzamna, a very important Maya deity, and as a Maya leader, he then has to take on the battle with Quetzalcoatl when the Toltecs invade. And this story is about that. It's about first setting up Zamna as a major leader and a major figure for his people, and then his heroic battle with Quetzalcoatl, the story ends with the sign of Zamna's hands being engraved onto the stones. There's the red paint of his hands engraved onto the stones as a lasting symbol of his courage, his bravery, his presence, his enduring presence. There are some crossovers here with what we can in fact find, for example, on the walls of some of the buildings in Tulum. Their hands engraved, red painted hands engraved on the walls in Tulum. So Abreu Gómez has played here with some historical references, and he has made Zamna into this all-enduring presence. One of the things that characterizes these stories is the humanity. So even though Zamna is a pre-Hispanic figure, the story is written as if it was happening today, and today could be 2021, or it can be in 1940, and it's written as if we're talking to another human being, not a god, not a battle of gods. So that's a very important framework for the reading of the stories that are going to continue. No? So the second story is called Nachikokom, and that's set in the Auto de Fe of Mani, which was carried out by Bishop Landa in 1562, when he interrogated, tortured, arrested several Maya leaders from Mani and Sotuta, and then burned all the what he considered to be idols. He burned books, he burned porcelain figures, all sorts of important archaeological materials, and in the fictional rewriting of this, Abreu Gómez introduces the figure of Nachikokom, who was a Maya leader previously. Before 1562, he was involved in leading the resistance to the Spanish conquerors, and he was largely responsible for some of the battles leading up to finally the Spanish taking control of To and setting up in Merida. He was finally overcome after 1542, and then became another member of the society. But Abreu Gómez brings back into this story his earlier rebellious spirit and his leadership, and he brings him into the context of the Auto de Fe de Mani, and brings him in as a voice speaking in Maya. Abreu Gómez says in the story, and these are the words that Nachikokom spoke in Maya, but I am translating them for you. So he writes them in Spanish, although he gives an idea that he would like to include the Maya language. He doesn't do it, though, notably. So he brings Nachikokom in as a rebellious figure in the context of this very important event. So we have now two conflicts in these stories, both of which are unfavorable for the Maya people. They lose, in inverted commas, both these events, and the Spaniards and the invaders take power. So then the third story is Canek, and this is a version of the Canek uprising from 1761. And I'll go into more detail in that in a little while, but it's very interesting that Canek is then set up as the third uprising, and he's also really treated as a prophet. And this ties in a little with the Maya cyclical belief that after each invasion, another will occur and another will occur, and they looked upon Canek in this way as really as a god who was as a king who was destined to come among them and lead this rebellion. Then so these are the stories that are held in these two books, in Canek and in Maya Heroes. The Conjura de Shinum is set during the Caste War in 1847, from 1847 to 1901. It's a very interesting book that follows several of the Maya leaders. Again, it follows closely the war from the point of view of the Maya soldiers, of the Maya leaders, and not the white Creole leaders in the Yucatan. And similarly, the shipwrecked Indians is set during the French intervention with the Empress Charlotte's visit to Merida in November 1865, as I mentioned earlier. And this again, it's a visit that occurs during the Caste War. So it's an important visit. She's making a point, and the story. There's some very interesting scenes when the household, one of the households that she's going to visit, is making all the preparations, and Abreu Gómez describes what's happening in the kitchen, and all the Maya servants to the house that are preparing for this visit, and he sets up there the beginnings of the plot, which is going to overthrow the Empress, and so it's all the planning that goes on underground, in the almost like underground rumors occurring all through the base of the novel, at the bottom of the house, in the basement areas. Of course, this uprising didn't actually happen, but he sets it up as very possible. And if we put this back into the context of the Caste War, it's totally imaginable that this visit of the Empress would have set up conflict, would have brought about tensions. And so he sets to describe that side of the story. So once again, we have him focusing on rebellions, on Maya leaders, on conflicts that occur within the society that he tells from the side of the Maya and not from the side of the Yucatecan Creoles. So there's a very interesting line that develops throughout this set of work. So here's a few quotations from the Maya heroes. The story about Zamna starts off saying, this book tells the origin of Zamna. Beneath these stories, the truths of history are almost always to be found. He's talking there also about the oral stories. Another of the strong lines that goes through all these works is that he takes his facts from the oral stories that are transmitted to generation to generation, and they're the ones that he heard when he was a child growing up and hearing these stories told, sometimes in Maya, often in Maya. The same, this is a fragment from the end of the story about Nachikokom, and this is the part when he brings Nachikokom into the to try and interrupt the Auto de Fe, and it's almost as if he's brought in and burned in the flames, which didn't actually happen, but there's this magical realism effect of Nachikokom speaking through the flames, and described here. And before he finished speaking, a harsh wind blew up, agitating the bloody ashes, blowing them up into the air and throwing them down like a stone from the heavens on Bishop Diego de Landa's face. This is going to be again, like the Zamna hands in the stone, this is the everlasting presence that you're never going to be able to, it's always going to be there in the air, in nature. And with Canek, again, another of these aspects that's brought into the story from the very beginning is his relationship to nature, to the environment, to his senses and his sensibility. So here we have Canek listening, using sounds to be one of the ways that he will find his connection to the people. And so this starts off describing how he lives in a hut set back from the road, and as he returns each day after work, he sits down, lights his candle, and then in the silence he listens, and so he hears the footsteps of each returning worker and identifies with each one of them. So not only do we get here the sense of Canek being related to space, related to place, and related to the people, but we also get the intimacy of his relationship with the workers, and that this story is going to be told from this point of view. So these are my Abreu Gómez Maya heroes. They are all portrayed as they're all really portrayed from the inside, with great humanity, with great intimacy, and with a lot of dialogue. So you really know what's going on with each of these people. In the version, the 1940 version of Canek, I think I'll get to this a little later on, but it's almost written this aspect of the intimacy and the dialogues. It's really almost written as if it was a theatrical text, as if it's written for theatre, which is very, very interesting. So the historical Canek his full name was Jacinto de los Santos, known as Jacinto Canek, and he was born in Campeche, in San Francisco, Campeche, in 1730, and he was tortured and killed in Merida on the 19th of November, 1761, at the end of the rebellion, when after he was defeated by the Spaniards. The painting here on the left is one of the murals in the government palace in Merida, in this main square in Merida, painted by Fernando Castro Pacheco. And here the painting is of course, the torturing of Canek. He led the Maya uprising in 1761 from the village of Quistel, which is near Sotuta. In 2019, the Merida government decided to launch a new competition, really, to replace this horrendous monument that we have in the Avenida Canek, which some of you may well know, at the close to the roundabout with the ring road. There's this huge monument to Canek, which is great. There is a monument to Canek, of course, but this is a particularly ugly version of Canek, and none of the not at all worthy, really. And so in 2019, they announced a new competition. I don't know what the winning monument is. This monument is still there, so whoever won it still hasn't been replaced. But that's from one version in the palace to this version in the Avenue statue. So we hope that soon there will be a new monument to Canek. So let's go on. So how does he? What does he do with this story? How does he make these crossovers between history and literature? So one of the most important things I think to say is that these really, as I said earlier, really with many of his stories, he goes back to the oral stories to find his Canek, and not to what was written down in the history books. And there was a particularly distorted version of history that was circulating through the 19th century about these Maya leaders and Maya rebellions. Many of the 19th century liberals, really much of 19th century liberal ideology was very antagonistic towards the Maya people, and so you can imagine that the newspaper reporting of any mention of Indian rebellions during the 19th century was not pleasant, was not favorable to them. So he goes back to the oral stories. This is one of the oral stories that he used to hear concerned the life of Canek, and his adventures and declarations stayed engraved on my memory. And this is going to be taken into his fictional recreation in a very interesting way. The 1940 version of Canek is written, as I said, almost as theatre, and it's divided into 5 sections. The first one is called Characters, and he introduces really the main characters there, which is Canek, the principal female figure, who is Aunt Chari, who is I assume the wife of the owner, although the owner is not mentioned, and her nephew called Gui, and a Maya female child called Asia. Those are the main figures, along with all the workers who are working in different aspects of the hacienda. So those are introduced in the first section called Characters. In the second section called Intimacy, there's a very interesting play on words with this title. In Spanish, it's called Intimidad, which can be related to intimo as intimacy, or it can be related to intimidar, or to intimidate. And it's, I think, a very appropriate ambiguity, because in this section, it's a very long section. The section ends with Gui dying and Exa disappearing, and in all this build-up of the intimacy between the characters, Canek has been describing a series of abuses from Aunt Chari to the workers and to himself and to Gui through all the build-up. So it is a build-up of intimacy, and that we get to know the relationships between these characters, but it is also a build-up of intimidation, as we see the constant abuse that is occurring in the hacienda. It's very important that all of this story happens exclusively within the hacienda, and it's totally a space of conflict. Which marks a departure from much of the earlier work in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Whenever haciendas and hacienda owners were described in the literature, it was always a harmonious relationship. This is in some ways a reaction to the caste war. So even 19th century novels and stories that were written during the caste war would describe they would be written by Creole writers, and they would describe totally harmonious relationships occurring in the haciendas. Now, so why is this caste war happening? We don't, we treat our workers perfectly. So Abreu Gómez's version is totally different in that sense, because he sets up the hacienda, and he's writing in 1940, at the end of the Cardenas period. He sets up the hacienda as a space of conflict, and he describes during all this period of intimacy the buildup of abuse in the hacienda. So then it's logical when we get to the third section, which is called Doctrine, which is where we see these statements and declarations of Canek. And each section is introduced by the phrasing Canek said. And this is when he makes his, it's really him giving his doctrine, his code from which we should live by. And again, there's a variety of processes he goes through, relating like these two that I show here on the slide. The white man knows nothing about the land, the sea, or the wind, and he describes how the lack of knowledge, or the lack of interest, empathy, integration of the white man to the Maya community causes damage, abuse, and exploitation. And so some of the statements are regarding the Maya mindset and the Maya way of thinking, and some of them are more to do with the transmission of knowledge, the importance of oral stories, the wariness of histories that are written by the white man and tell other truths. And so he goes through a series of statements relating to knowledge, to how we gain knowledge, how we deal with knowledge, how we transmit knowledge, and also to how the Maya should be able to defend themselves. This leads up, of course, to the fourth section, which is injustice, and then full-blown war in the fifth section, which is a very violent exposition, really, of presentation of the battle that is finally going to occur. Another of the very interesting departures, two very interesting departures, further departures from previous literature occur here. One is that with all this build up to the war, and not just starting with the war or focusing on the war as the main section, we have been able to see Canek as a person, to see him as a leader, to see him as a friend, colleague, person who is highly respected in the community. And then the natural consequence of all the abuse is the war. This didn't happen in earlier works, where the Canek was reported in several works as a drunk baker. Often he was reported as drunk, and they used to say that the rebellion started because a party got out of hand. This is a totally different representation, a totally different portrayal of a man who is spiritual, of a man who is related to his community, and much more in tune, actually, with more recent historical research, which Robert Patch, for example, in the 1990s, wrote a very interesting article stating that the reasons behind the historical rebellion of Canek were much more cultural in order, which is actually much more in tune with what Abreu Gómez presents in this work 50 years earlier. The other very interesting aspect to this representation, this portrayal of the Canek story, is actually this statement that he puts at one of the prologues that he writes later for the novel, when he says that by web chance some of my life and other persons weaves into the history of Canek. This is very important, because as we read the book, we realize that there's actually no marking of time. There's nobody. There's no part of the story that actually says we're in 1761. The language is contemporary. The characters are made as contemporary people. They're you can relate very easily to them, and that's even so now, reading it 80 years later. They are timeless figures, and that's one of the very, very important strategies that he uses in the book, because it actually means that we can relate to and understand the continued abuse that is still occurring 3 centuries later. So this is a very, very significant part of the story, that it has become a timeless space, a timeless history of Canek. No? He later in that prologue describes how he based the figure of Gui on himself. He was a very sickly child, how he bases Aunt Chari on one of his family members, and the sympathetic priest is a priest that he related to closely in his own life. And so, and the abuse, one would understand from that comment, is also abuse that he saw around him or lived or saw being inflicted on other people. So this timeless aspect of the story is very, very important, and gives a whole new context to the importance of the Canek rebellion in the story of Yucatan and the race relations in Yucatan. My apologies for the noise and the pause just a little bit ago. I have some very noisy dogs, and they were not helping this recording. Just to sort of, maybe I think I should start to sum up a little bit. The crossovers with the story of Canek, with the Maya hero, and what happens from 1940 and how we read it in 2021. I had at the beginning of my research in Yucatan many decades ago. I had done some work on Abreu Gómez and on this story, I'm always aware it's a story that I always work with, but I hadn't actually returned to it in a number of years. And so I thought, well, how different should my reading of Canek be now that we have much more, now that we are much more focused on race relations in a world context, in Black Lives Matter, now that we are more focused on the possibility, on the realities of Maya Renaissance, Maya literature in Maya language. How does this change my reading of Canek? What does Abreu Gómez do or not do in this context? What is his attitude or his portrayal of his Maya characters? No? So, and I think in that context, I mean, clearly we can't ask him to do things that were way before that are going to happen way after his time. I think there is clearly an awareness of injustice, and he has a very clear belief in social ethics, in the importance of the community, and in the importance of the Maya communities in the Yucatan. Is he separate from them? Does he idealize them and create a them and us situation? Of course he does. He's a man of his time. But there's a very important, in terms of literature, there's a very important rewriting of previous fictionalized versions where he does make these Maya characters his protagonists. They are telling the stories, not in Maya. They're telling, he's writing the story for them in Spanish, but he places them at the center of the stories and their conflicts at the center of the stories. And so I think that is a very important shift. The other important shift is to introduce space and environment as very, very significant markers of the thought process of the narrative story. Nature and environment is so significant in his work, and he dismantles the haciendas, this harmonious place that it was in the 19th century, and he presents it very much in accordance with Cardenist government's way of working. He presents it as a space of conflict. And I think these are very important stepping stones that set up Abreu Gómez's work as different to what went before, very different to Antonio Medis Bolio's work. And really, I think he's not, in my view, these these changes or these rewritings and the introduction of these new directions are really not taken up again until we get to, and they're not taken up again in Spanish writing in the Yucatan until we get to Joaquín Bestar in the 1980s. And really, of course, we don't get the full impact of what figures Maya peoples should be how they should be written until we hear it from Maya writers themselves. So until we get Maya writing in the 1980s, 1990s, and the huge revival up in this century, the 21st century, there's not going to be a major change. But the impact of Abreu Gómez, I think, is huge. I think he does make a huge contribution to the way the literature is read. And actually we see it's very interesting to see how, to make that point a little bit more directly, if we look at some of the comments that were made about Canek, the book, when it was published in the 1940s, it's fascinating to read the critics in those years complimenting Abreu Gómez or describing the book as how wonderful the fictional Canek is, and they stress how wonderful the fictional Canek is, how different he is from the historical Canek, as if he'd actually reinvented the story or reinvented the historical figure. And as I say, when we move forward 50 years to 1996 and Robert Patch's research, we find that the Robert Patch's Canek actually ties in very closely to the Canek that Abreu Gómez is describing. So he's not so much a fictionalized version of history. But in the 1940s, they were unwilling to accept a Canek that could be a real person. No? And so they write in these reviews, the fictional version is better than the historical version. How fascinating he is as fiction, but we don't want to have him as real. Yeah, it's a very interesting description. Some reviewers, especially when in the light of shipwrecked Indians and the Conjuro de Chinum, then as I've tried to do today, they tie together this line of social justice in Abreu Gómez's work and relate to Canek as the first step in this, and remark when they're reviewing the later works how evident this line of social justice is in his work. And I think that is a very, very important thing to make clear with regard to Abreu Gómez. It's very significant that he was speaking out in this way from the 1940s onwards. I think, as just to finally sum up, I'm now getting to the end. I'm at the end, really. He really does make Canek is a break with literary tradition. He has a Maya as protagonist. Hacienda is a space of conflict. Storytelling, the oral storytelling and storytelling itself is as important as history, or more so. And he uses nature and the environment as part of this way of telling stories. Just to finally end with another image of the author, and these two final quotations. Jaime Torres Bodet, another very important Mexican writer, calls Abreu Gómez a universal Yucatecan, which coming from somebody who is not Yucatecan, is, as Jaime Torres Bodet, is a very important statement. He's a universal Yucatecan. And one of my favorite parts of Canek, which comes from towards the end of the third section, the statement of when he's writing the declarations, the doctrine, the section doctrine, he says, and when the word came, it did not come alone. It came with an echo sweeping across the land. So I will close there and just finally say that there are a couple of translations in English of Canek. One made in the 1970s, I think, in the US. And I just sort of sound my own trumpet. I translated Tales and Legends of Yucatan, Tales and Legends of Ancient Yucatan. There's a version published by Dante in the 90s, which was one of my first attempts at doing literary translation. So my apologies if it's unreadable, but that does include the version of Canek, the short. It has a translation of the short version of Canek, which is in the context of Maya heroes. It has Ana, Nachikokom, and Canek, and it's reduced to 3. For that version he condensed the 3. He condensed the 5 sections into 3, and it's not written as theatrically as the full 1940 version. But there is a version in English. But I highly recommend the Spanish if you're interested and if you can read this. So thank you all very much. I will leave that here, and hopefully we can engage in a conversation through WhatsApp or through Bob, and if anybody has any comments or queries, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you all very much. Have a great day. Bye bye.